November 15, 2024. Peyton Wiley's body was discovered early the next morning. I found out when Daichi called me after breakfast and said he was headed our way again. The feds were asking us to come back in for another meet and greet, and I felt a terrible foreboding. Ma had been at work at the drug mart until late the night before, and was still in bed by the time Daichi arrived, so we left her to sleep and headed to downtown Grand Haven. The bureau offices were again buzzing with activity, and this time when we came through the doors we found Sugawara waiting for us. He walked us back to a room with a two-way mirror on the wall, and an overhead fluorescent bulb that gave our skin a sickly hue. Daichi and I sat down and Sugawara asked us if we wanted anything to drink. I'd brought my own bottled water this time, and Daichi declined, but Sugawara left us anyway, saying that he was going for some coffee. We waited patiently for him, but after 20 minutes it was clear that he was leaving us to sweat. Daichi got up to pace and he even went to the door, but he found it locked, and that seemed to infuriate him. After 2 hours the door opened, and in walked Sugawara. He had a record storage box with him and he set it on the table in front of us. My heart was pounding. I knew that whatever was in that box was bad. "Have a seat." Daichi started in on him right away. "Is my nephew under arrest?" he barked, pointing to the door. "Because we came down here, Sugawara, on our own good faith, and you locked us up in here without charging him, which is illegal." Sugawara cocked his head, and he wore a mocking sort of smile that I knew only angered Daichi more. "Was the door locked?" "Huh, sorry about that. Sometimes the door sticks, like at your sister-in-law's house, and it can be a real pain to open." Daichi's fists clenched, and I could tell he wanted to storm right out of there, but Sugawara calmly lifted the lid of the box and peered inside like he had a secret treasure he couldn't wait to show us. Daichi looked at me, raising an eyebrow. I shook my head slightly. I had no idea what was in the box. With a sigh, my uncle took his seat and crossed his arms. He'd put up with this little charade only as long as it took for Sugawara to deal his hand, then I knew he'd demand to leave. Sugawara sat down, but kept the contents of the box hidden from us. "As you may have heard, we found Peyton Wiley's body early this morning down by the Walikiki River about a half-mile from where Tevin Tybalt's remains were discovered." My mouth went dry. I knew that much, but it was still hard to hear. He then reached into the box and pulled out an evidence bag. Inside was what looked like a torn-up image of a kitten with its paw raised. It had been taped back together a bit haphazardly, but I recognized it immediately as the card we'd sent to Peyton. Daichi scowled. My efforts to save Peyton had just come back to haunt me. "Know what this is?" Sugawara asked me. I didn't even have to look at Daichi to see if I should answer. He'd already told me at the restaurant the day before. "Yes, it's a card that Yams and I sent to Peyton Wiley." Sugawara's brow shot up. He seemed surprised by my answer. I knew I had to tell him why we'd sent it, so I began with the football game, pointing out that I'd seen both him and Ushijima there, and while we were in the stands I'd seen Peyton's death date. It was coming so soon that I freaked out when I saw it. I left the stands, and Yams came after me, so I told him what I'd seen. He wanted to go back then and there and warn her, but with you guys in the bleachers and all the stuff that happened after I read for Mrs. Tybalt, I didn't think that was such a good idea. Daichi leaned forward. I had also told my nephew that he was not to verbalize any death date he saw to anyone. I nodded. Right. But Stubbs and I both felt really bad for Peyton, and we decided that we had to try something to warn her, so we bought that card and wrote out a message to mail to her. I know the message sounds weird, but we didn't know what to say to get her to listen to us. We'd overheard her tell her friends that she was getting a new car for her birthday, and we kind of assumed she was going to be in a car accident. Neither one of us thought it would end like. My voice trailed off. It was still hard for me to fathom that Peyton had been murdered. Sugawara was eyeing me with intense scrutiny. I couldn't tell if he believed me or not. "You didn't think it would end like what, show? Like this?" And he reached inside his box and pulled out a photograph, slapping it down on the table in front of us. I looked away. He'd used this tactic before, and I didn't want to go through it again. "Jesus," Daichi hissed. Out of the corner of my eye I saw him flip the photo over. "Really, Sugawara? My nephew is 16. Quit trying to shock a reaction out of him by showing him these crime scene photos. Sugawara reached out and flipped the picture back over. I didn't look away fast enough, and I caught a glimpse of Peyton's face, her eyes open, her cheeks swollen and bruised, a gash on her forehead, and a large open wound at her neck. My eyes watered, and I squeezed them shut. I heard Daichi's chair scrape the floor. "Sho, we're leaving." "Oh, I'd advise against that." I peeked out at him, and he was leaning back in his chair as if he double-dog dared Daichi to leave. "At least not until you hear me out, counselor." Daichi picked up the photo and tossed it at the agent. "You have 30 seconds to tell us what you want, Sugawara, and then I'm walking Sho out of here, and if you even think about flashing another gruesome photo at her, I'll be on the phone with the DOJ demanding they investigate your tactics before I'm even out of this building." Sugawara picked up the photo from the floor where it had fallen and put it back in the box, but he still seemed really angry, and I could understand, because what had happened to Peyton looked worse than any nightmare I could imagine. But I wasn't responsible. He had to know that. Sugawara inhaled deeply, and it seemed like he was trying to rein in his anger. He then looked me square in the eye and tapped the evidence bag with the card. "Here's the thing, Shoyo. We didn't find this in Peyton Wiley's trash." My brow furrowed. "We found it in Tadashi Yamaguchi's trash can." My jaw dropped. That made no sense. "See, Agent Ushijima and I went over to reconfirm your alibi with him, to check if maybe he wanted to change his story. Your buddy stuck to the facts, but he was so nervous and jumpy that we felt he was hiding something. So, later that night we swung by again and noticed that he'd set out the trash. You don't need a warrant to go through someone's trash, did you know that? We picked up yours, too, by the way. You guys need to recycle more." I felt the blood drain from my face. Ma hid her empties in the trash because she didn't want our neighbors seeing how many liquor bottles were in the recycle bin. "So Tadashi never mailed the card," Daichi said, the vein at his temple noticeably throbbing. I knew he was furious at the agent for that last comment. "Is that a crime now, Agent Sugawara?" Sugawara seemed to ignore him and went back to fishing around inside his box. I felt myself bracing for what might come next. He retrieved a sheet of paper and set it on the table. I was so tense and on edge that I immediately turned away. Recognize him? I didn't look until I felt Daichi's hand on my arm, and then I focused on the piece of paper now on the table. It was an artist's sketch of a man's face, and even though it was a pretty rough sketch, the first person I thought of when I looked at it was Yams. My pounding heart was like a wrecking ball in my chest. I knew that Sugawara could tell I saw the similarity, but I smelled a trap, so I shook my head. "No," I said, but it came out in a whisper. "Really?" Sugawara said, all shock and awe. "You don't recognize your own best friend Shoyo?" Daichi was looking from me to Sugawara. He smelled a trap too. "You have his answer. What's your point?" Sugawara pulled out another document. It looked like a handwritten letter. Then he pulled out another and another and another. Daichi lifted up the papers and began to read, but I was focused on Sugawara, who in turn hadn't taken his eyes off me. "Those are witness statements from Peyton's fellow cheerleaders. They all give pretty much the same story. They say that last Monday afternoon right after cheerleading practice, Peyton was approached by the boy in that sketch and he had a pretty amazing story to tell her. He claimed that he was psychic, that he had visions that often came true, and that he'd seen Peyton at a football game and was overcome by a vision of her being killed on her birthday. He didn't give her his name, but he warned her not to drive her new car, which he said he'd also seen her getting for her birthday." I felt my blood turn to ice. I knew instantly what Yams had done. He'd taken the card after leaving me at Starbucks, and he'd had second thoughts about sending it, knowing it was likely Peyton would think it was a joke. He'd probably decided then and there to ignore all my warnings and headed straight to Jupiter High only a few blocks away. And after I'd told him that Peyton had been murdered and the feds had come back to question him about my alibi, he'd panicked by tearing up the card and throwing it out in the trash to get rid of the evidence. With a sudden horror I knew exactly where the feds were going with this. They thought Yams had murdered Peyton. And since her crime scene photo had resembled Tevin's, it wasn't a leap to think they'd try to pin his death on him too. While I was putting all of that together, Sugawara reached into his box again and pulled out yet another statement. Here's a witness statement from Peyton's coach, who told us that a boy resembling this sketch approached her and claimed to be from the Poplar High newspaper. He was very interested in the new star on the team, Peyton Wiley. This was before the football game show, when you supposedly saw Peyton's death date. And we checked with your school's newspaper. Tadashi doesn't contribute to it, and he never has. He didn't do it. I blurted out, panic-stricken about where this was heading. Daichi's hand clamped down on my arm, but it was too late. Didn't do what? Sugawara leaned forward. Or maybe I should ask, who didn't do what? I looked at Daichi, practically pleading with him to let me talk, to let me explain it to Sugawara, but the warning in my uncle's eyes was clear. I wasn't to say another word until he gave the okay. What does any of this have to do with my nephew? Daichi demanded. Sugawara pulled out a picture of Yams. It was his sophomore yearbook photo. The agent held it up next to the artist's sketch. See a resemblance? Daichi kept his eyes on Sugawara. Again, what does this have to do with show? Sugawara set the articles down. It has everything to do with him, counselor. The boy in the sketch is his best friend, this Yams character. We've got him here now, and he says it was all Shoyo's idea. He says that he came up with a plan to kidnap and kill Tevin Tybalt, convinced him to do the dirty work, and they both enjoyed it so much that they went looking for another victim, Peyton Wiley. My mouth fell open and a noise came out from deep inside me, one that was unbidden and primal. Daichi's hand squeezed my arm again, and I barely managed to stop and get hold of myself. Cut the crap, Sugawara. Daichi snapped. Tadashi said no such thing. If he had, you would have arrested Sho by now, but you've got nothing but a torn-up birthday card, a crude sketch, and some witness statements that I will tear holes through in court. You have no proof that the guy in the sketch is Tadashi, and no proof that he actually harmed Peyton Wiley. Sugawara seemed unfazed by Daichi's outburst. He rubbed his chin before leaning forward even more, his large frame hanging over most of the table. You know what else I find interesting? His question was aimed directly at me. I found myself shaking my head, and I couldn't seem to stop myself. I didn't want to hear it, whatever it was, because it was all a lie. Your best friend's statement is your only alibi for the day Tevin Tybalt was kidnapped and murdered. We've been looking at the timetable, Shoyo. It seems Tevin may have been abducted later in the day on the 29th than we thought. We think he was taken anywhere between 3 and 9 p.m. So, I gotta ask you, who's covering for whom? An involuntary squeak bubbled up from my throat, and Daichi's hand clamped down on my wrist again. We're going, he said, half lifting me out of my chair. But Sugawara wasn't done with us quite yet. Quick as a flash, he took out a folded piece of paper from inside his coat pocket and snapped it open right in front of Daichi. Daichi paused when he saw the paper. It looked official. Snatching it out of Sugawara's hand, he started to read it. We've served out a search warrant, Sugawara said casually, and from the box came something else that froze me in place and turned my cold blood to ice. This we found hidden in Shoyo's nightstand. He held up my death date notebook and wiggled it back and forth. It makes for really interesting reading, if you like names and dates. So many names and dates, Shoyo. My breath started to come in short little pants, and the world began to spin. Here's a name and a date that's pretty interesting, Sugawara said, thumbing to one of the last pages. Tevin Tybalt, 10/29/2024. Daichi's face drained of color, and he looked at me with a mixture of shock and horror. I'd never told him I kept the notebook. I'd never told anybody, well except Yams. Sugawara flipped the page. And here, in one of the last entries, we have the name Peyton Wiley. Next to that is the date 11/12/2024. For a long moment nobody spoke. Sugawara continued to thumb through my notebook while Daichi clenched and unclenched his jaw. Finally, he said, "Is my nephew under arrest?" My knees threatened to give out from underneath me, but Daichi held my arm firmly, supporting me. Sugawara took his time answering, but finally he said, "Not yet, but soon." Switching his focus back to me he added, "Don't leave town, Shoyo." Daichi moved me toward the door, but Sugawara stuck his leg out, blocking us. "The warrant extends to his phone. His voice was hard as steel. I looked at Daichi, who eyed the search warrant in his hand and nodded for me to comply. With trembling fingers I removed my phone from my pocket and set it gently on the table. I tried to think what texts might be on the phone that could incriminate me, but my mind was a jumble of panicked thoughts, and I couldn't remember. We exited the room, and Daichi held on to me the whole way. "Look straight ahead," he whispered as he moved us steadily down the hallway. As we were nearing the exit, though, from around a corner came Agent Ushijima and another agent, and between them was Yams, his arms bound behind him. "Say nothing," Daichi whispered harshly into my ear. I was so stunned to see Yams handcuffed and being escorted by 2 agents that I was at a loss for words anyway. But Yams lifted his chin when he saw me. He looked terrified. "Sho," he cried out. Tell them it wasn't me." A sob formed in my throat, and as we passed each other I tried to reach out to him, but Ushijima glared and blocked me with his body while Daichi pulled on my arm to keep me away, but then he leaned over and said to Yams, "Do you want my help?" Yams nodded desperately, and Daichi said, "Don't say a word until I get back, Tadashi, do you understand? Mr. Yamaguchi is now represented by counsel. You cannot interview him until I get back, got that, Ushijima?" Ushijima made a face like Daichi could suck it, which prompted Daichi to shout back at Yams as the 3 moved past us. "Don't say a word, Tadashi. Nothing, you hear me?" I craned my neck to look back at Yams. He was openly weeping, and he was now slumped between the 2 agents, who were holding him up and moving him along while Yams's feet practically dragged on the ground. "Yams!" I cried out to him, and Daichi's grip on my arm got even tighter, but I didn't care. I wanted him to know he wasn't alone. I'd do whatever I could to help him. By the time we made it to Daichi's car, I was crying so hard that I couldn't catch my breath. It was a while before I realized that Daichi had driven us a few blocks away and had parked on the side of the road. He was rubbing my back and waiting for me to get it together. At last I lifted my chin and pleaded with him. "You have to help him, Daichi. He didn't do anything. He only wanted to warn her. That's all. It was all because of me. I told him about her numbers. It's my fault, not his." Daichi rubbed my back again and squeezed my hands. When I could look at him without sobbing he said, "Kiddo, none of this is your fault. I promise you that I'll help Yams, but you have to be straight with me first." I sniffled and wiped my cheeks. "I have been straight with you. I told you all about the card." Daichi eyed me critically. "Did you know that Yams went to that high school to warn Peyton?" I shook my head vigorously. "No, I swear, he never told me. I thought he'd just mailed her the card. I had no idea he'd done that." "What about what her assistant coach said? That Yams had an interest in her even before you saw her at the game?" I shut my lids and put a hand on my forehead, so exhausted and distraught that I felt hot and feverish. "You know how much Yams likes to watch the cheerleaders, right?" Daichi nodded. He heard that the Jupiter squad had challenged our squad to a matchup before the football game, so he went to watch. That's when he saw Peyton for the first time, and I don't know. She was such a pretty girl and I guess he started crushing on her right away. He was curious, so he asked the coach a little bit about her. It was harmless, Daichi, I swear. I believe you, but it doesn't help us that he scoped her out before you saw her death date, show. My eyes welled again, and I wanted to curl into a ball. It was my fault. If I'd never said anything to Yams about Peyton's death date, then nobody would have ever heard about his casual conversation with her coach. What's the deal with the notebook? I shook my head and dropped my gaze to my lap, so ashamed to have him learn that I kept something like that. I knew how morbid it made me look. It helps me cope. I need to do something with all those numbers, Daichi. They're everywhere I look, and writing them down helps me deal. I see so many people who think they've got another 50 or 60 years ahead of them, they have no idea that death is so close. It breaks my heart all the time to think about that moment when they'll know that they have way less time than they thought, how hard that must be for them to realize they're about to lose everything and leave everybody they love behind. What I didn't say was that I thought it had been that way for my dad, but I had a feeling that Daichi knew exactly what I meant. When Daichi didn't say anything I picked my gaze back up and saw his eyes were moist. He lifted his hand and cupped the side of my cheek. I can't even imagine how hard it must be for you, kiddo. I'm sorry you have to deal with that. And I'm sorry you have to deal with all this. I'll do everything I can to help you, though, okay?" I nodded, and without another word he drove us home. When we pulled onto my street we could see it crowded with vehicles and vans. Then I saw a few men and women wearing dark blue windbreakers with FBI stenciled in yellow on the back. Our front door was open and the feds were walking in and out of it, carrying paper bags and my MacBook, which Daichi had given me for Christmas the year before. Daichi pulled over in front of Mrs. Duncan's house. As he got out to go confront the agents invading our house, I saw Ma dressed in her Drug Mart smock and standing with Mrs. Duncan. Ma's whole body was shaking, she'd been crying, too. When she saw Daichi she let out a sob and ran to catch up with him. Part of me wanted to go comfort her, but I found that I couldn't bring myself to move. I wanted to blame so much of this on Ma. If she hadn't practically forced me to do those readings for strangers, we wouldn't be in this mess. If she didn't drink away all our money every month, we wouldn't need the extra cash. If she hadn't moved us here in the first place. If she'd known what the numbers meant when I was little. If she'd put it together sooner and had warned Dad. If I had never been born. Except that Tevin would still be dead. So would Peyton. And my dad. Ma finally caught up to Daichi, but her hysterics forced him to lead her away from the cluster of agents, and he walked with her back toward Mrs. Duncan's. Across the street I saw Kathy and the rest of the Hutchinson family out on their front porch, openly gaping at the scene unfolding on our lawn. Ignoring them, I got out of the car and headed up the walk toward our kindly old neighbor. "Oh dear, Mrs. Duncan said, when she caught sight of me. You look a fright, show. Why don't you come inside and I'll fix you some tea?" I sniffled and glanced at Daichi. He had Ma wrapped in a hug while she cried on his shoulder, but he nodded at me. "I'll be in soon. Go with Mrs. Duncan while I take care of your mom." I lowered my head, trying to hide my tears. Mrs. Duncan's kindness touched me deeply. Once inside, she put me in her cozy kitchen, which was a bright yellow with gleaming white trim. It smelled like cinnamon. "Are you hungry, Sho?" she asked. I shook my head. Mrs. Duncan filled a kettle and placed it on the stove to heat up before she set down a plate of chocolate cookies in front of me and smoothed out my hair. It was such a tender gesture that it nearly undid me. Mrs. Duncan moved to a cabinet and brought out a box of tissues. She set that down next to the plate of cookies, and pulled out a chair next to me and held my hand, repeating over and over again that I'd be okay. I appreciated her calm, grandmotherly demeanor more than I could say. By the time she set down the steaming cup of tea, I had wiped my eyes and gotten myself together. Ma and Daichi still hadn't come in, but I could see through Mrs. Duncan's front window that the street was still lined with spectators and cars. To distract myself, I cupped my hands around the mug and let the warmth seep into me. Mrs. Duncan brewed herself a cup as well before settling across from me. "How are you doing in school?" she asked. The fact that she was making an effort not to ask me about what was happening next door wasn't lost on me. I looked up at her forehead, and felt a wave of sadness. She'd be gone by the end of February. "I'm doing okay, I guess," I told her, my voice hoarse. I cleared my throat and added, "I should make the honor roll again this semester." Mrs. Duncan beamed proudly at me. "I always knew you were such a bright child, Sho, but the honor roll. That's wonderful. I worked hard in school. I really wanted to go to Cornell, but Daichi had flat out told me that there wasn't enough money left in the trust to support 4 years at an Ivy League school. If I got in, I'd have to do it on what he could manage to give me from the trust, and scholarships and student loans and maybe even part-time work. I'm trying to get into Cornell." She blinked in surprise. "You are? Oh my, Sho, that was my alma mater." I sucked in a breath. I'd never pegged Mrs. Duncan for an Ivy Leaguer. In fact, I'd never pegged her for anything more than a sweet old lady. "You went to Cornell." "I sure did. Class of '54. That's where I met Mr. Duncan. He was an assistant professor and we weren't supposed to date, but we did. We were married a week after I graduated." Mrs. Duncan's eyes had a shiny faraway cast to them, and I could see how much she missed her husband. Then she focused on me again. You would have liked Mr. Duncan, she said. He was a lovely man. And so smart. He was always downstairs in the basement, tinkering with some new invention. He sounds nice, I said, taking up one of the cookies. He was wonderful, she told me. I miss him terribly. At that moment there was a knock on the front door, and Daichi entered. Hey, the feds left. You can go back home, Sho. Where's Ma? She's inside. She's had as bad a day as we have. The feds went down to her work to serve the search warrant, and then her boss came by with the stuff from her locker. He fired her. Why? He can't do that, Daichi. It's not her fault the feds came to search our house. Daichi shifted uncomfortably and eyed Mrs. Duncan. Her manager didn't fire her for that, Sho. Your mom had something she shouldn't have had in her locker. It wasn't anything illegal, but it was against company policy. And then I knew what had happened. Ma's manager had found open liquor in her locker. Oh, I got up quickly. Mrs. Duncan stood, too. She reached out and took hold of my wrist and said, "Wait one moment, Sho." She then moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a large casserole dish. I made this lasagna last night, and of course I made too much. Why don't you take it for you and your mother to heat up tonight? I started to shake my head, feeling uncomfortable with the thought of accepting so much kindness, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. Yes, yes, she insisted, putting the heavy dish into my hands. You eat it all up now, Sho. You're far too skinny for your own good. Daichi wrapped an arm around my shoulders. Thank you, Mrs. Duncan, we really appreciate it, and Sho will return the dish in the next few days. I nodded, and Mrs. Duncan smiled and walked us to the door. We headed over to my house. Make sure you clean that really good before you give it back to her, okay? I nodded dully. My attention was now focused on the trash left behind by the FBI agents. There were small plastic evidence bags blowing around on our lawn, and a set of discarded black rubber gloves had been tossed onto the driveway. I looked around at the other houses and found the lawns empty of people. The curtains at the Hutchinson household caught my eye. They were pulled back, and I could see Kathy's mom staring at us. The venom in her gaze sent a chill up my spine. Shrugging deeper into my coat, I walked a little faster, until we'd rounded the corner to the back door. Ma, she's upstairs, Daichi told me, taking the casserole dish out of my hands and moving it to the fridge. Opening the door, he stared at the inside for a sec before setting the big dish in it. The fridge was mostly empty, so I knew there'd be room. How can you live like this? He asked me sadly, once he'd shut the door. We buy only what we need. I said defensively, only then noticing that much of the kitchen was in disarray. Cupboards had been opened and rummaged through, and the contents of several drawers had been emptied and refilled, but there was still a lot of clutter on the counters. I hastened to start cleaning up, but then remembered Yams still all alone at the FBI offices. Are you going to go help Yams? I asked when Daichi continued to stand there and look around at the mess in the kitchen. His gaze moved to me, and something in his eyes hardened. Sho, sit down for a minute, okay? Let's talk. Obediently, I moved to the kitchen table and took a seat. Daichi took up the chair across from me, and for a long moment he simply stared intently at me. I need to ask you something that I know is going to upset you, but before you answer, I need you to really think about it. Because if I'm going to represent Yams, then I need to know what I'm up against, do you understand? My brow furrowed. I couldn't imagine what he was about to ask me. Okay. Daichi took a deep breath. Are you positive that Yams didn't have anything to do with either Tevin Tybalt or Peyton Wiley's murder? I was so stunned that for nearly a full minute I could barely form words. Are you kidding? I finally managed. Daichi knew Yams. He knew how kind and sweet he was, how awkward and geeky, too. Yams didn't have a mean bone in his body. And he certainly could never torture and kill 2 kids. But Daichi's face was dead serious. Did Yams know about your notebook? I blinked. Yes. So, think about it, Sho. He said softly. Think about what, Daichi? I demanded. Yams couldn't hurt a fly. You know he would never intentionally hurt anyone. Daichi inhaled deeply again and sat back in his chair, still looking doubtful. Maybe you don't know Yams as well as you think you do. I shook my head, staring at him in disbelief. Why would you think he could have anything to do with this? Daichi tapped the tabletop with his index finger. Because you're the perfect foil, he said simply. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about until he started to explain. If I were a kid as smart as Yams but with a screw loose and I knew you and what you could do, I could take advantage of it. You say that some other kid is about to die on such and such date, and maybe that kid's going to die of natural causes or in a car accident, but I get to him or her first. Maybe I make sure they die on that date, and maybe I make sure lots of stuff points back to you. Maybe when the heat comes down I start to say that you did it. I tell the feds about your notebook. I tell them that you're the sick one. I began to shake my head, slowly at first then more vigorously. How can you say that? Daichi, you know Yams. And you also know Sugawara was lying. Yams would never accuse me. But Daichi only frowned and dropped his gaze to the table. I haven't talked to him yet, Sho. He reminded me. And you're right, I do think Sugawara was lying. But I also know the law, and that's why I don't honestly think it's a good idea for me to represent Yams. What? I nearly shouted. Daichi, you have to help him. Daichi sighed and drew a small circle on the table with his finger. Hear me out for a second, will ya? I glared at him, refusing to answer. He continued anyway. Anybody who's ever watched a crime show could figure out that this scenario sets up a solid case for reasonable doubt. It could turn into a classic case of he said she said. I could head over there right now, sit with Yams while he's interviewed by the feds, and during that whole time I would advise him not to say much of anything. Even less than I've let you say, actually. And then I could leave, and the second I'm gone he could start blabbing. He could tell the feds that he's waiving his right to counsel and that he wants to confess. He could say that you're the crazy one. You're the one who kept notebooks on when people were going to die. You're the one who told Tevin's mother that her kid was going to be murdered. You're the one who said she saw the date when Peyton Wiley was going to die. You're the one who came up with the plan to send Yams to talk to her and tell her that she was going to die on her birthday. And guess what, Sho? The second he points the finger at you, I won't be able to help you. I could recuse myself from representing Yams, sure, but I'd be barred from representing you, because the courts would view it as a conflict of interest, having already represented the guy who's now accusing my nephew. They'd say that I had inside information or knowledge that might make Yams's defense vulnerable. I was shaking my head, hard. Yams wouldn't do that. I insisted. Daichi, please, you gotta trust me. He's my best friend in the whole world. He's the most loyal, honest, sweet, kind person on the planet. He couldn't hurt anybody, and besides, he liked Peyton. He was trying to save her. And he was the one who made me call Tevin's mom before he went missing to try and get her to listen. He even told me that he'd wished he'd called her himself to vouch for me. It bothered him so much that her kid might die, that he was willing to do anything to try and save him. Daichi's expression became alarmed. Did he contact Mrs. Tybalt directly? I shook my head, but then I stopped and realized we'd called her on his phone. No, but it might look like he did. Explain. Daichi ordered. He looked up her information on his phone, and we called her on his cell. I confessed. Daichi pressed his lips together and shook his head. So he had her information. I nodded. Then he knew where Tevin lived. Daichi, I swear, we only called her. He'd never go to her house after she threatened to call the police on me. When his eyes widened I added. I tried to explain to her that I was for real, but she wouldn't let me talk, and she threatened to call the cops if I ever called her again. Daichi frowned. See, this is the problem I have with what you've just told me, Sho. You didn't know Yams had gone to see Peyton until the feds told you about it, and now I learn that he looked up the Tybalt's info on his cell. You may not know your best friend as well as you think you do. Daichi, he didn't do it. Before their bodies were found, he had no idea that Peyton and Tevin were going to end up missing. I didn't even know Peyton was missing until I saw it on the news, and I didn't know that Tevin had been abducted until Ushijima and Sugawara came to the school. Daichi stood up and paced the kitchen floor for a minute or two until he seemed to come to a conclusion. Okay, Sho, I trust you, and I'm sorry if I upset you, but I had to play devil's advocate to find out how much you really trust Yams. I've seen way too many of these cases where a defendant suddenly points the finger at his innocent best friend to risk having that scenario happen to my nephew. Still, I think you're right about Yams, and I promise I'll do my best to represent him. But if either of you two lies to me ever again, all bets are off, got it? I swallowed hard, both hugely relieved and guilt-ridden. I sighed with relief. Got it. Thank you for helping him. I'm really sorry about lying to you. He nodded and reached into his pocket. He shocked me even more when he pulled out a large wad of cash. Here, he shoved the bills into my hand. What's this? I stared at the money, which I knew we could use but couldn't accept. Your mom lost her job. And I'm keeping you from making money on readings. Cheryl refuses my offer to help every time I ask, so I'm bypassing her and giving you a little nest egg. I shook my head, trying to hand back the cash. Ma would totally freak if she found out I'd accepted the cash. Daichi pushed the cash more firmly into my palm. I'm not taking no for an answer. He insisted, finally letting go to walk to the door. Hide that somewhere your mom won't find it. And I knew he meant that I should keep it away from her so it didn't go towards booze. I gotta go back and see about Yams. Do me a favor, though, don't write down any death dates until we get this cleared up, okay? I hung my head. I won't. Sorry. I should have told you. Daichi came back to the chair and ruffled the top of my head. It's okay, kiddo. I have to figure out a way to convince the feds to lay off you two and start looking in another direction. I thought back to the accusing look in Sugawara's eyes as he held my death date notebook. How are you gonna do that? Daichi moved back toward the door. I'll need to reach out to one of my contacts to do some research. I don't know if it'll pay off, but if it does, it'll hopefully take the focus off you too. What is it? I was desperate to know, or, more accurately, I was desperate for some kind of hope. Daichi's face softened. Let me worry about it, okay? I gotta go see Yams, and then I'll come back and we can heat up Mrs. Duncan's lasagna. After dinner we'll go out and get you a new cell phone. I want to be able to get a hold of you if something develops. Then he was gone, and I was left alone with Daichi's wad of cash still in my hand. I looked around the cluttered kitchen for a hiding place, and my eye landed on the Garfield cookie jar. We hadn't used it in years. I went over and lifted the ceramic lid. Inside were several stale-looking double-stuffed Oreos. Ma kept the jar only because my grandma had given it to us one Christmas. I knew she'd never think to look inside, so I stashed the cash under the Oreos. After that, I got busy putting the house back together, periodically checking on Ma, who was nursing her wounds with a fresh bottle of vodka and the TV. It took me several hours to get the house straightened up, and during much of that time, Daichi's devil's advocate argument filled my thoughts with ever-darkening storm clouds.